Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different on the channel. We are going to tier rank all the mythics from the latest set coming out, Duskmourn. We have pre-release. I'm going to pre-release on Friday. So I want to kind of take a review of the cards, kind of what we can anticipate. I'm going to be focusing on the mythics from the set for this video, and we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of constructed in this sense. We will have a tier here, as you see on the screen, of EDH, where cards are more so built for that format and unlikely to see kind of a placement in there. So this is kind of my thoughts on it. Very happy to have discussions if you disagree with it or think otherwise. Things should be higher, lower. If I'm wrong on anything, let me know in the comments and we can kind of see and calibrate. And then what I'm going to be doing afterwards is I always think it's a fun exercise to, once a set comes out, like a month in, look back at this and see if we were right or wrong about any of these calls. And just see, kind of vet our homework in a way. It's very easy to say, oh, this is S tier, and then we end up with cards that are unplayable. So we are going to start off. We are going to look at cards, go over them, and then hop into the tiering itself. So the first card up is Abhorrent Oculus. So this is almost a throwback to a card from Innistrad, Scab Ruinator. That had a requirement of exiling 6 cards from your graveyard. What you get is a 3-mana 5/5 flyer, so well above rate. At the beginning of your opponent's upkeep, you manifest Dread. So this is a new mechanic. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one on the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature and the other in your graveyard, and you could turn it up. It's basically just another way of morph for creatures. So this kind of enables your future ones. We do lose out on some cards, but they're like that self-enabled us. But we do have things like Founding. There's the Squirming Emergence deck that looks to kind of mill yourself over in the format, in like Standard. In other formats, it could be reasonable, just ways to kind of fill your graveyard. You have Stitcher Supplier. There's a bunch of like cheap cantrip style effects that can help you self-enable. There's a lot of, think of it almost as like a Delve style effect. It's Delve 6 plus 3 mana. I think this is kind of a reasonable card. It's an army in a can. It dodges a lot of the cheaper, like it dodges cut down. It still gets hit by Go for the Throat, the white based removal. It dodges temporary lockdown, but the creatures it makes do get hit by temporary lockdown. It plays you a little bit more into Sunfall, but at the same time doesn't really require you to put more pressure on the battlefield. I think I would give this, let's give it I think this card might be actually pretty good. Let's put it in the A range. I'm interested in this one here. I don't think it's going to be the best card in the set, but I think it is something that could be fairly interesting as we kind of play out the games. So next up, so we have these rooms. So think of rooms as almost 2 spells in one. You can cast either half, and then as a sorcery, you can pay later to unlock the other half. So we have Charred Foyer. 4 mana at the beginning of your upkeep. You exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. So kind of these 4 mana enchantments. We had Experimental Frenzy, which was very good at this. This is just once per turn. So it's a little slow in terms of getting started. And then once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast from exile. All in all, I don't think this card for the rate, maybe if it was 3 mana, could be reasonable, but we have like Case of the Crimson Pulse that's much better at doing this. You're not going to, this is going to be going into a bigger mid-rangey control style deck, but even then, like, you don't want to play with counters because you don't want to, it's the beginning of your upkeep, so you can't use that counter that turn, so it works out a little poor. All in all, I think Charred Foyer is more of a commander card than anything. So let's add the Charred Foyer into the EDH section. We then have Dollmaker Shop Porcelain Gallery. So a little bit cheaper on the front side. We have 2 mana. Whenever 1 or more non-toy creatures you control attack a player, you create a 1/1 toy artifact. So this is a nice way to put increasing pressure on your opponent without committing more to the board. And then late game, if you do Flood, creatures you control have base power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. So it's a long game anthem with an early game token enabler. It fits nicely on the curve. You could play it at 2, so you could go 1 drop into this, attack, you get a token, and then just kind of snowball from there. It doesn't self-enable itself, so that's something to note. It's non-toy creatures, so that's something to keep in mind. I think this is another strong card. I don't think it would see play in extended formats, but we do have stuff like the Caretaker's Talents decks that care about tokens, so this is another way to kind of enable there. You have ways with Mirror Pool or Fountain Port, Mirror Pool, Fountain Port to kind of enable to draw you cards as well. I think this is probably a solid A, all things considered. All right, so now we got the Pokemon Vmax section. These literally look like I have my Giratina, or here's my Growlithe Vmax. I'm not a fan of these arts. The rainbow foil just makes it look even more like that. So we got Enduring Courage, 4 mana. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield, it gets +2/2 or +2/0 and gains haste on the turn. When it dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It is an enchantment. So we had it was a Goblin Pile Drive or War. There was a Goblin that did this similar effect. This one has the upside that if it dies, it still flips as an enchantment. So you do get that value. The main thing with standard is a lot of the removal or like the mass sweepers tends to be exile based in terms of Sunfall, temporary lockdown. For the mono red decks, a lot of them are prowess based as opposed to kind of swarm style. This could be interesting in a convoke deck more so, but even with the convoke decks, they're usually like 20-ish lands, so getting to 4 lands is a little steep. The rate on it on its own, it's a 4 mana 3/3 that doesn't do anything the turn it comes down. You need something to enable the token. It dies to Lightning Strike, it dies to Cut Down, dies to pretty much everything. It's other than Cut Down, so that's something to kind of consider there. It's often going to be trading down with like 2 drops in terms of combat. All in all, I think this would be like a C tier. I don't think it's really that powerful, all things. Like, it makes all your subsequent threats, but you're better off just playing like War Leader's Call that pings and is an anthem style effect. All right, we got Enduring Innocence, 3 mana, 2/1 lifelink. Whenever one or more other creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability triggers once per turn, and then it becomes an enchantment. So this one's a lot more interesting. It fits in the 3-drop slot. It is something that you could collect a company into. The rate on it isn't huge, but we've seen stuff like Welcoming Vampire, Toskia's Welcome get played in some of these shells in terms of like white weenie decks. It can help you against the more aggressive decks. Drawing cards in those decks usually comes at a bit of a premium. It's not something we normally get. So I think this one is fairly reasonable. I wouldn't put it like super high because we've seen kind of white weenie take a step back. It could go into like the black-white bat style strategies. It could be reasonable with tokens, but I don't think you want to play this in like a Caretaker's Talent. I'm probably going to say this is like B tier in terms of enduring it. This is probably going to be like the best of 1 white weenie style strategy. All right, then we go to Enduring Tenacity, 4 mana, 4/3. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, and then this is an enchantment. So it's got the keywords to become a casual all-star, the gain life, drain life, the Dina style effects. If this sees play, it would go into the black-white kind of Amalia style life gain decks. It is a little fragile. Being a 3/4 might have been a little bit more interesting than a 4/3 in terms of stats. Again, just being hit by a lot of the common red removal at 3. Verse 4, it is a little pricier on curve, requires you to have other cards in your deck that gain life. It itself doesn't self-enable. Like, this is probably part of a combo in EDH, like any of those other effects. I think we put Enduring Tenacity at probably C tier. Let's put it there. Alrighty. Enduring Vitality. So 3 mana, 3/3. Vigilance. Creatures you control have add 1 mana of any color. So it's Crystallith Right on a creature. And then when it dies, similar, it flips. This one's interesting if you are doing stuff like token go wide that you're ramping into it. We've seen Crystallith Right, I can't even say that word, in the past see play. That one was, I think, a 1 mana enchantment to make it a little bit easier on curve. So it's kind of like, what are you ramping into that's considering going early and then kind of going from there. In like, if you're playing an Atraxa deck, you're probably playing Domain, so you're not really ramping it to Atraxa or to your big stuff. There's not like a Craterhoof style effect in the format. There's Moonshaker Cavalier, but that's probably not where you want to be in this type of shell. And then kind of just looking at it, there's like the token decks. I'm just thinking there's Insidious Roots, but you still need Tyvar to take advantage of it at that turn, and the roots themselves would tap for mana, so you're not really getting that benefit. I just don't really see where this would have a fit in like standard or stuff like that. And then in extended formats, we have the rights that just doesn't see play as it is. So I think this is probably, it's like D to C tier. I'm going to put it at D tier. I just don't think it does really what you want in terms of the format. All right. Funeral Room Awakening Hall. 3 mana. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And then Awakening Hall. When you unlock this door, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the first half has the potential, if there's a way to kind of get a loop going, to be an infinite combo enabler. So just something dying and reoccurring over and over again. This could be something, again, like this would be reasonable to bring in if the format was not on Sunfall Sweepers. If your opponent's sweeping your board, like how we had Meathook Massacre, that would drain, kind of be that win condition in itself to lose that life. The problem is a lot of it's exile based. Meathook had a lot more function with this. If you're tapping out on 3 for this, it's really not doing much on your own. And 8 mana is a lot to kind of bring it back, especially in a format where Sunfall exists, exile removal exists, temporary lockdown, leyline binding, all these kind of effects that kind of take it out from there. And this is only your graveyard. It's not like it's all graveyards to kind of play into effect. I think the rate, this is just too expensive for what you're doing. Let's put this in the D tier. I just don't think this card is reasonable. And then let's move on. We have Haunted Shrieker. 3 mana, 3/3. When it attacks, you manifest Dread. And then for 2 mana, you can reveal target face down permanent. If it's a creature, you may turn it face up. So there was the manifest, or I think it was, theme from Murders at Karlov Manor that was like in Simic colors that cared about face down as well. So you have multiple ways in this kind of, I think there might be a shell with like Simic face down that could be kind of interesting in terms of seeing cheating into play. This is also a way that you can have big creatures and, like, you know, 2 mana surprise Atraxa. This on its own doesn't do anything until it comes, like, it needs a full attack stage to actually do anything. It's also a pretty small body, just being 3 mana, 3/3. We have like 3 mana, 4/5s in green. It's also green, so it comes with the natural downside of potentially seeing limited play in monocolor decks. Simic wouldn't necessarily have tons of removal. I think this is probably a C tier card. It has the potential to kind of get higher up there. If like the Simic deck turns out to be reasonable, but on its own, like if we look, it's worse than Glissa, it's worse than Preacher, it's worse than even like going on. I don't think it does enough on its own. If it wasn't enters or attacks, it could have been a little bit more interesting, because if it enters and attacks, then you, for 3 mana, you get 5 power. That's a lot more interesting as opposed to this that. Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. So we have Ninjutsu Planeswalker. So Ninjutsu, for those unfamiliar, basically if a creature is unblocked during an attack step before damage is dealt. You can pay a ninjutsu cost and basically swap that creature for Kaido instead. So Kaido comes when it's your turn. Kaido's a 3/4 ninja and has hexproof as long as it's your turn. So this comes in, sneaks in, deals some damage, could let you reset some cheap creatures. Pixie, bats, anything with like, I'm thinking like 1 mana, 2 mana evasive creatures, flyers, stuff like that. You get some value out of it. Resets your enter the battlefield effects as well. There's not really ninjas, I don't believe, anymore in the format. If this was in like Kamigawa, I think this card would have been really sweet to just kind of boost up that ninja theme deck. In Historic, I'm interested to see if this kind of brings back the ninja deck, which was very good at one point, and then Modern Horizons came out. The emblem gives your ninjas +1 power. Now, no, you're not really going to have many ninjas outside of Kaido, so it's more kind of building up Kaido. Surveil 2, then draw a card for each opponent who lost life this turn. So you can ninja it in and then activate its ability after. And then you can kind of tap target creature, put 2 stun counters on it. So it's a way to kind of get rid of blockers afterwards as well. Interesting card, I think, because like if we look at, we have the Gix decks that play a bunch of cheap creatures, like the Dimir kind of tempo. So it's a way that you could kind of sneak it in. It is a threat that could kind of snowball, provide you card advantage. It's only going to be, even the zeros, just Surveil to draw. I think this is probably, if we had more ninjas to kind of take advantage, I think this is probably, this has like the potential to be good. Okay, I'm going to take a chance. I think it might be good. I could be definitely wrong and see it as its C tier. This one I'm really curious on. Let me know what you think on that. All right. We got the sequel, the Meathook Massacre 2, the remasking. So 4XX. Okay, so this cost already scares me. Enters the battlefield. Each player sacrifices X creatures. So this on its own requires you to pay 6 mana to have basically to sack 1. So Sheoldred's Edict, 6 mana, but you have to sack a creature as well. Now, if we look at it mainly for the enchantment mode, so we don't really care about the X until you're like late game. It's gonna be very hard to kind of get big mana into this, like unless you're playing like a Sultai kind of doppelgang style shell. Whenever an opponent you control, whenever a creature you control dies, you may pay 3 life. If you do, return it under your control. So this is also a little tricky because you're paying life. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, they may pay 3. If they don't, return it under your control finality counter. So you have to play this kind of in a deck. It's a Punisher style effect where you could potentially get creatures, but if you're not putting pressure on your opponent and you're playing this more in a control shell, they're more than likely going to be happy to pay 3 cards or pay 3 life. I just think this is overcosted in all the ways. Like if this was 2XX, I could see it being reasonable. Maybe even 3XX. Have 6 mana to like just get you your price of entry to kill 1 creature. And then 4 mana does nothing the turn it comes down. Just seems very, very slow. I am going to put this. I honestly think this card is useless. Like D tier, just get rid of it. Like not that good of a card. Maybe in like EDH when you generate huge amounts of mana, it'd be reasonable. But for constructed play, I don't think this is anything reasonable. Mirror Room Fractured Realm. 3 mana. When you unlock this door, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it's reflection. And then if a triggered ability of a permanent you control triggers, so it's Panharmonicon afterwards. So thinking of what you can copy, it's not restricted to legendaries. We already have Mockingbird that does it probably more effectively, better on curve. This can do better against like bigger things, but on its own, I just don't see it doing much. The Panharmonicon effects rarely see play. This is another one that I think is like D tier, EDH bound, if you may. I'd probably say it's more EDH kind of coded than anything. Nico, Light of Hope. 4 mana, 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 shard tokens. They're enchantments with sacrifice this enchantment, scry 1, and then draw. So it's a better kind of clue style effect. And then you can pay 2, exile target non-land creature you control. Shards you control become, sorry, non-legendary. Become a copy of it until beginning of your next end step. Return to the battlefield under its controller's turn at the beginning of the next end step. So there's not the restriction of sorcery speed here. So you can blink your creatures to protect them from removal, and then you get copies of it. You can like Terror the Peaks, make copies of all your creatures, have them become copies of Terror Peaks. Sounds kind of cool. Obviously that's like Magical Christmas line, but for just kind of value plays, have creatures become copies. Even thinking like if you play this in the blue-white Caretaker shell, you're making a bunch of tokens. The Nico shards help draw you cards off that. And then say you have like 4 tokens and you have a Beza out, you just make 4 copies of Beza. Obviously, actually, no, you can't because it's not legendary, so you get around that. So you'd have to look at other creatures. I still think this card's like kind of reasonable just thinking through it. It's 3/4, so the stats are fine. It provides you some card advantage, especially in those shells, and it can kind of protect your other creatures. So it's probably why the non-legendary clause is there, so it can't blink itself. I think this card could be super reasonable. I am gonna put this. I'm gonna give this an A. I think just with Caretaker's talent, it's such an engine. It seems super reasonable with ETB style effects. And then here, end step, return to the battlefield. Oh, shards you control, not other tokens. So it's only shards. So you need to have other shard enablers. So actually, you know what? With that condition, I'm going to put it as a B. So a little bit of a reading the card explains the card. So I thought it was any token. So shards you control become copies until end of turn. So if it's only the 2 shards, you're only really making 2. But I still think it's reasonable. So then we have a Mythic Overlord cycle. So this card here, they have impending, which are kind of like time counters. So you can cast it for impending. If you cast this card for its pending cost, it enters with 5 time counters on it. So it's like suspend. If it isn't a creature until the last one is removed, the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So this, you could play it on 2. It takes 5 turns for it to come into play. Whenever it enters or attacks, mill 4 cards, then you may return a non-avatar creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. This is a 5 mana 5/5 that just doesn't really do much. It'll draw you a card potentially, but in and of itself, like if it was returned from graveyard to play, super interesting. To hand, I don't think it's going to be doing too much. This is going to be C tier at best, I think. Overlord of Boilerville. So this one's interesting. Had it not been for like Atraxa being the best thing to kind of cheat into play in most formats. You still have a tally, which is also better. This one's an interesting effect. So the impending does have to get cast earlier. I'd be a lot more interested in this if the impending was like 2 mana, 3 mana, that you could consider it in like mono red deck, a more aggressive deck to be like a big top end. But at 4 mana, then you got to wait 4 turns. You're probably dead as the aggressive deck. So this naturally falls into mid-range control style card. Impending 4, so when it enters or attacks, deals 4 damage to any target. So this gets rid of a lot of the permanents. Does not get rid of Shieldred, but gets rid of most of the other creatures that are not big reanimation effects. Interesting in this regard. I think this could be a B tier if it does find a shell, but I don't think it's kind of the be all end all. We then have Overlord of the Flood Pits, 5 mana, 5/3, impending 4, and then it's 3 to kind of impend. Another card that could be interesting in like mid-rangey control, flying, 5/3 is reasonable, but does die to most red-based removal, Elspeth Smite, stuff like that. So you don't want your 5 drop to lose to like a 1/2 drop. And then when it enters or attacks, draw 2, discard a card. So this can enable some of the graveyard synergies. It can just provide you some sustained card advantage. Just looking at this card compared to some of the other stuff, I don't think it's that great. This is probably like, again, C tier at best. Alrighty, so Overlord of Hauntwoods. This one does seem very good. So 5 mana, 6/5. Already the stats much better. Like if we look at the other one, it was a 5/3, 6/5. Like, well, it doesn't have flying. It does a lot better. So when it enters or attacks, create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. Hello, Domain. One card that enables Domain on its own with Leyline Binding. This helps you ramp. This is enters or attacks, so it just helps you kind of ramp up doppelgang style effects, domain effects, everything like that. Impending, this fits nicely on curve with 3 mana. So you get it a little later, like if you want, but this fills just kind of the curve of early ramp into bigger threat. I think this card is going to be very good in standard, in the shell that already kind of exists. I think we're going to give this our first S tier. I think this card is going to have the biggest impact in terms of domain and one of the stronger cards for the format that we've seen thus far. This could enable, like, even, like, there's the Lions deck with Burma and the Lizard to ping. This is another way, like, it attacks and you just ping. And then it helps you kind of ramp and stuff like that. Gives you more fodder to sack, so it's got a lot of utility there. Overlord of Mistmoors, 7 mana, 6/6. Impending 4. Whenever it enters or attacks, you create 2 white insect creatures with flying. This is another interesting one for either the Caretakers decks as a way to kind of stow away, or in like terms of control decks. This is a big beater. It closes the game out very quickly. So the turn it comes into play, you get 10 power. So it's a 2-turn clock on its own. No protection to it, but it does leave some bodies behind. I think this is a very strong card. I'm going to put this as an A tier. We go to Screaming Nemesis. We have a red card, folks. We have a red card. Apologize for the dogs. So whenever Nemesis is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. If a player dealt damage this way, they cannot gain life for the rest of the turn. Okay, so some great keywords there. So we have the Boros Reckoner style effect. So it'll fling damage. It goes to any target. So you can use it to kill creatures. So it makes like attacking and blocking kind of awkward. This is a way that so combat damage does not turn off life gain for the rest of the game, but any sort of damage to it will. So Archangel attacking into Atraxa basically can fling the damage. They can't gain life. You can also have it as a way to kind of trade with an Atraxa, just straight up. There's a lot of incidental life gain in the format. This can shut that off. Now, notably against a lot of the black-based decks, they're not going to care about it at times because they'll just have like cut down style effects, removal. White can have sweepers. So they're like, it's much better. It's not a be-all, end-all because it's not like if it deals damage. It has to be dealt damage this way. I think this is a super reasonable card. I'm going to put it probably B tier. Like, if it was any damage, it'd be an S tier. It's B tier, I think, just given the constraints. Because on its own, it's a 3 mana, 3/3 haste. Not like crazy. I think you're playing in like the Squee Terror. Like, Godric doesn't see any play anymore. So it's kind of, it's good in the mirrors, like red mirrors. I think it's a super reasonable card. I don't think it's the best card. The Rollercoaster Ride. 3x. So weird casting cost. It's got Delirium, one of my favorite mechanics. So Delirium cares if there's 4 more card types in your graveyard. So the source you control will deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player while there are 4 more cards in your graveyard, deals double that damage. When it enters, deals X damage to up to each of X target creatures. So this is a sweeper that requires some mana constraint. Late game, it's cheaper. Early game, it's not. This is not the 3 mana sweeper you want. Realistically, you would have to even at 5 mana, it deals 2 damage up to 2 creatures. We have Pyroclasm coming that just does that for 2 mana. I don't think this card is really good at all. I'm going to put this as a D tier. The Wandering Rescuer. We had like 2 months with no Flash Wandering Emperor, so it is back, folks, in some constraint or some element. 5 mana, 3/4, Flash Convoke. So Flash Convoke, you can tap creatures at instant speed. This is going to make combat that much more interesting. The double strike, so it can ambush Viper a bunch of creatures, and then other tap creatures you control have hexproof. Super reasonable. Protect your cards. Opponent goes to use a removal spell, hexproof it, flash it in, protect your stuff. We already have Convoke Shells in the format. This is a nice top end. It is 2 mana to cast in most of the Convoke Shells, or even actually less, because the Convoke can cast the colored. This could be like free cast in the deck, and it's just a really powerful effect to protect against removal. Even at its own rate, like a flash threat, I wouldn't be unheard like a mid-range deck just playing it, because even at like 3/4 mana, even full cast, just like flash a double striker that can protect other things later. I think this card's super, super reasonable. I'm going to give this A tier. All right, Tyvar the Pummeler. 3 mana, 3/3. Tap another untapped creature you control. Tyvar gains indestructible to end the turn. Tap it. So kind of regenerate-esque ability. Not the death. Not notably, there's a lot of exile in the format, so this kind of invalidates it. And then it's a mana sink. Creatures you control get +XX, where X is the greatest power amongst creatures you control. Might be something for the Cryptolith, right? Creature, the elk thingy with all your things tapping for mana, but there's too much exile, I think, in the format. Green on its own is not the best. A 3 mana 3/3 is not the best stats on its own. This isn't attacking into like creature that well. Like a lot of the bigger, like the 4 drops gonna eat it up. 3 drops can trade for it. This could be a combo enabler if there's a way to gain infinite mana in a format just as a mana sink. This could also see like an historic for like elf decks, stuff like that. This could be a nice mana sink as well for the strategy. But I think all in all, C. We got a big boy. Valgoth Terror Eater. 9 mana. 9 mana for a 9/9. Flying Lifelink. Ward. Sacrifice 3 non-9 permanents. So a very punishing effect. So it like oftentimes will require multiple effects. This could get Edict, but other than that, it's going to force your opponent to pay a price. The body's really nice. I think this is going up there with Atraxa as one of the top reanimation effects. Atraxa's, offense, defense provides some card advantage. This one does require you to you can't attack and hold back at the same time. We do have the other additional effects. So basically, any card that's put into graveyard from your opponent goes to exile instead, and during your turn, you may play cards from exile and then use them as any color. So it's kind of card advantage engine in another way. You will have to have your opponent either like trade stuff or kind of go from there. I don't think it stacks, so if you have a second one come in, it doesn't see the first one. I think this card's going to be a nice reanimation threat. I think this could be very difficult for some, like, we look at Vein Ripper in some of the other formats, just with Ward 1 being a difficult. Now, this is non-9 permanents, but it's still 3 that need to be sacrificed. I'm going to do it, folks. We are putting this as S tier. I think in reanimation shells, this can be very strong, and at the very least, it's not just Atraxa auto-occlude. I think this is a very strong effect. And then the last mythic, Walking Closet. 3 mana, you may play lands from your graveyard. Forgotten Cellar. When you unlock the store, you may cast spells from your graveyard this turn. If a card would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So this is only once a one-time effect. It's not always. So that really makes it worse. So you really got to consider it just for the Walking Closet side. So the only deck I think that would care about playing lands from your graveyard is the Analyst style decks that self-mill. They have a lot of ways to get lands back anyway, so I don't think you really want this. This is better. I just don't think this is something you play in Constructed. This could be like EDH fodder, probably. That's where we're at with it. Alrighty, so we have our list. S tier. We have Green, Big Boy, and Yavmik, or whatever. And then we kind of have it through here. Really interested to see what you think. We'll kind of take a look back and see where all these cards fall. And then let me know what the feedback. We can do one of these for the rares as well in the set. Just kind of give us a thought process in terms of looking at the cards. My dog's telling me it's time to go for a walk, so we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Have a great one.